Alright guys, welcome back to the fourth tutorial of this series. So this is going to be the last Maya tutorial on this part of the series, where I show you how to set up your render layers and render passes. We'll also be setting up ambient occlusion as well as ZDepth. If that sounds interesting, let's get started. Okay, right, so now we are ready to start setting up our scene for rendering. So we're gonna make use of render layers, so it's this button over here. I already have render layers integrated into the UI. So render layers give us the option of rendering certain objects or lights separately. And it also allows you to specify specific render settings on a per render layer basis instead of the master layer. So what we're looking at right now is this scene layer, which is considered the master layer. And the eye indicates that you're looking at it. And this clapperboard means that this is renderable. So if you batch render this means that this layer would render. So right away, we're going to turn this off because we don't want this master layer to render. Instead, we're going to specify 3 separate render layers. One is going to be for the plane, one is going to be for the exhaust, and one of them is going to be for the background. To create a new layer, we're going to just click on this new layer button and we're going to type in plane. Once you have a layer, you're going to right click over it and then you can create a collection. Now, collections can hold transforms, which are going to be objects. And you can also do things like shaders, lights, and there's quite a few other options for you there. We're just going to be using transforms. And what we want to do is take this turbulence node and you can either middle mouse can drag it up, or if you pull this over, there's an option to add an object. So you can add the object in there, or you can simply click and drag it up here. What we've just done, if we've added the plane in there, and if we click this little eye, we now switch to that render layer and you notice that the exhaust goes away. Now by default, all lights will be on all of your layers. Now you can customize this, but for what we need, we do need all of those lights to be across all of the scenes. So I'm going to switch now to my camera view, and I'm going to also go back to our 200 frames here. And we're going to just find a good frame. This will be pretty good for what we need. And then I'm going to go to the IPR. So what we want to have is the plane by itself, and right now we are getting the background in there as well. So the reason we want to separate elements inside of Maya is so that when we work in After Effects, it's much easier to composite. So for example, if we look at the alpha here, the entire alpha is occupied with pixels. And in order to control elements of this plane, like doing color correction or adding some heat distortion or whatever, or adding some kind of depth, it's going to be very, very difficult to control without having a matte of just the plane. And even with a matte pass, it's much more difficult to control if the background is occupied. So we need to go and disable the background from rendering. Let's go into our V-Ray dome light, go into options, and make sure you click invisible. So now you can see the background's gone, and if we look at the alpha is only occupied over the plane. Okay, so I'm going to pause the IPR, and now we're going to go ahead and add a render layer for the exhaust. I'm going to select back on the master layer. I renamed both of these objects exhaust 1 and 2 just to make it a little easier to find. I'm going to create a new render layer, exhaust, right click, create a collection, and then just add these objects, or just middle mouse click and drag them into this collection. Now we can switch to this collection, and now we're only looking at the exhaust. Back to the IPR, and you can see just the exhaust is there. So another really, really useful feature of render layers is the ability to use layer overrides. For example, for this exhaust, we don't really care about the render quality of this, and we don't really care about the fact that there's reflections and global illumination, and it's being illuminated by this HDRI. So what we want to do is make some changes to make this render much, much faster. So if we go up to render settings, we can create an override for nearly any setting inside the render settings window. So we can go up to render using, right click, and create an absolute render override for visible layer. Now, if you don't see this feature, it means that you're still on the master layer, and on the master layer you can't override it because it is the main settings. You can only override custom layers that you create. So we say create absolute override for visible layer. This will now turn orange, and when it's orange, you should notice that it has added a tab up here called absolute override, and this allows you to change it. So we can say, for example, Maya hardware. So the Maya hardware 2.0 is a very, very fast render. If we were to just render a frame of this, you can see it's already done. Less than a second and it's done. And since we don't really care about any of the shading, we only need this as a matte. This is a much, much more efficient way than rendering all the detail and quality that V-Ray can provide. I'm going to close this down. Now, if we go back up to the master layer here, you can see that the master layer still is using V-Ray, and this plane layer is also still using V-Ray. So if you're using Maya for visual effects, or even just for regular rendering, you should be using layer overrides. It is much, much more efficient than trying to just brute force everything. Okay, so next what we're going to do, we're going to create one more override, and this is going to be for the sky. Switch to the sky. So the sky doesn't actually need any objects. And we don't even really need to create our own collection. Collections can be automatically created when we start making override changes. So what we want to do on this, since we turned the sky off inside the dome light, we're going to override that to be on, but only for this sky layer. So we're going to select the dome light, go over to where it says invisible, right click, and do create override for visible layer. When that is orange, you can click the check. Now if we go over to IPR, the sky renders. And you can see that a light collection has been added for us right here, and there's an override on this layer. So next what we're gonna do is set up all the render settings for each layer. We're gonna start on the plane layer. We're going to start on the common tab and just work our way down and across all of these other tabs. The very first thing is what we're calling the file and where it's going to save. So we're going to delete this, but we're going to use a file token here to determine the hierarchy of our file structure. So if you're going to be rendering many versions of the same file, which you probably will be if you're working for a client or even for yourself, you're never going to get it right the first time, and you should never render over previous versions. So we're going to make a folder. We're going to call the folder whatever the version number is. Click version, and then we're going to do a slash. So the slash indicates that it's going to create a new folder. Next, we're going to right click and do layer. So it's going to make a new folder called version and a folder with the same layer name as the one that we are currently rendering. Next, we're going to do another slash, and then this is going to be the name of the file itself. Right click, layer again, underscore, and then the version number. Now you can put your own file name, but if you're using this method, make sure you don't type this in manually. Just right click and select whichever one you want. So many students that I've seen have either written something incorrectly or not exactly how it's written here, and then it won't save any of your files. So it will still render them, it just is not going to save them. You also, if you have a version listed here, you have to have a version labeled. You can't leave it blank. If you leave it blank, again, it's just not going to save it. So in this case, we're going to start with whatever version your file is. I'm on version 2, so I'm going to start on version 2. Next is going to be the image format. You should never use PNGs if you're going to be doing some compositing. Always use EXRs, and for this we're going to be using multi-channeled EXRs. The multi-channel is going to allow all of the different passes, which I'll explain in a second, to be integrated into a single file. This makes compositing a lot easier, or replacing files a lot easier. Next, we're going to go down into the image format options. This is where you can change a lot of settings. Most of the time, I just leave this at 16 bits. We don't really need full float for what we're doing. You can, but it's going to make your file size a lot larger. We're just going to leave that there. Compression type, leave this on scanline zip. If you use uncompressed EXRs, they'll be enormous. So we're going to definitely compress them. Now this is a lossless compression, so it's fine to use. Okay, so next we're going to scroll down here, open up animation. You need to switch it to standard, and then the end frame is going to be 200. You also want to check render animation only in batch mode. If you don't click this, it will start rendering from the very beginning of the animation. However, if you want to view the animation without batching it, you can uncheck this and view the entire animation as it renders in the frame buffer. So next we're going to click on the renderable camera. This is going to be camera 1. For the presets here, you can just go down to HD 1080. We're rendering in 1920 by 1080. And next we can go over to V-Ray. Now for V-Ray, what we're going to be using, the CPU rendering, we're going to be using a progressive sampler. This is going to be a bit faster than Bucket because we can determine the maximum render time. For this first pass, we're going to keep this pretty low because nearly all the time that you render out something, there's going to be something wrong. So there's no point rendering a final quality if you haven't even seen what it looks like in After Effects yet. Next, we're going to go down to color mapping, and we're not going to allow any tone mapping or color mapping. So we're going to set the mode to don't affect colors, only adaptation. There's lots of different types of tone mapping, which I'll hopefully explain in another video, but just take my word for it. If we're going to be compositing all of this, we don't want to use tone mapping here. Next, we're going to go over to GI, and there's not anything you have to change here. Just make sure that it is on. We don't need to change anything in settings. In overrides, you need to go up to camera, and then make sure you enable motion blur. And then make sure viewport subdivision is checked. And there is something we have to do in environment. So let me just move this over. I will switch to IPR so we can see what this is going to look like. Now, previously what we did, we got rid of that background, which is what we wanted to do, but you'll notice that through the glass, that environment is no longer visible, and we need that visible in refractions. So what we have to do is go into our environment tab, scroll down, enable override environment, and then for the refraction texture, we need to load in the V-Ray dome light environment. I'm going to pause the IPR here, just move this over. So we're going to select the dome light, go over to our dome light shape, go to the dome text, And we never renamed this file, and usually I don't bother, but for something important like the HDR, we're gonna just name this Sky HDR. So now we can go up to the Hypershade, go over to Textures, and then it's easy to find the Sky HDR. Move this over a little bit. Then we're gonna middle mouse, click and drag this texture into the refraction texture. I'm gonna minimize this, go back over to IPR, resume it, and now you can see the sky is being placed back inside the glass. Okay, so now we can stop the IPR, minimize it, and move on. Okay, so the next important part is going to be the render elements. More commonly, these are just called render passes. So render passes are separate attributes of the beauty pass, and the beauty pass is all of the main passes that you need to create the shot that you see in the frame buffer. And by separating out all of these passes, it allows us to composite them in a much easier way. So for example, let's say you render out your plane and you think that the reflections are too strong. Instead of having to go back and re-render the entire thing again, you can simply go to the reflection pass and lower the opacity of that pass in After Effects or play around with the color correction. Likewise, you can do things like change the color of the stripe or change the amount of direct light it receives. There are a lot of different options that you can use here. You can also use diagnostic render passes and some other ones as well. If you would like to find out more information about this, you should check out Chaos Group's documentation. They have a lot of information and a lot of images that go along with these so you can compare what each of them do. We're going to be using a specific type of workflow here that requires some compositing, but not a lot of compositing. We're only going to be using 5 or 6 different passes, so it's going to give us a fair amount of control, but still there's a lot more control you can do with separating things like shadow information. So when you're adding your render passes, make sure you're on the layer that requires render passes. Neither Exhaust nor Sky actually need any render passes, and by adding them from the master layer, you're going to force them on every single layer. And it doesn't take any additional time usually to render out passes, with the exception of diagnostic passes and things like extra text or passes that do not comprise the beauty. The beauty pass is basically whatever the master layer renders and whatever is rendered to the frame buffer. The only thing that takes additional time is physically saving out those individual passes. It doesn't take any additional time to calculate them. So let's go ahead and add in direct lighting. So that's called just lighting. And when you do that, you'll notice that a AOV is added, and AOV stands for arbitrary output variable. Next, we're going to add in global illumination, so GI. Then we're going to need reflection, refraction, and you only need refraction if there are objects in your scene that are transparent or translucent. So we do have glass, so we need refraction. Then we're going to add in specular, and then we're going to do self-illumination. And it doesn't really matter the order in which you add these. And next, we're going to add in an extra text pass. Now the extra text pass is a special type of pass, which is actually an embedded render layer. So extra text passes do actually take longer to render. So whereas render passes generally don't take any additional time to render, render layers and extra text passes do. So a render layer is going to go in a sequence. So for this scene, the first render layer is going to be our plane render layer, then it's going to be the exhaust, and then it's going to be our sky. And just make sure that all of the ones that are rendered have this clapperboard icon turned on. This indicates that they are set to render. We don't need to render the master layer. So the more render layers you have, the longer it will take to render your scene. Generally, the more passes you have, it doesn't really make a difference, with the exception of the extra text pass, because it is in fact a embedded render layer. So we're going to rename this to be AO. This is only for our references. It doesn't change the name of the pass inside of an EXR file. So to change it there, we're going to click on Extra V-Ray Attributes, go into the explicit channel name, and also type in AO. Now for the texture, you can apply whatever type of material you want or whatever type of texture you want. So we can go into our texture, go up to V-Ray Dirt, which is our AO, and then we can see the results there. Now, just as a quick note, if you want to separate out different objects to use different AOs, you're going to have to use that in a separate render layer, and you would create a material override. And if you do want to use a material override with V-Ray Dirt, you first have to apply a surface shader to the material override, and on the surface shader's out color, then you add in a V-Ray Dirt. Okay, so let's go ahead and render this out and see what we have. In the frame buffer, the way that you cycle through your passes is go up here, you have lighting, so this is direct illumination. Then you have GI, which is going to be indirect illumination. You have your reflections, refractions, specularity. Specular refers to light at specific angles and usually more intense reflections. So we have quite a lot of specularity here, which is pretty good. Next we have self-illumination. These are just going to be for the lights. And then we have AO. AO is supposed to be for very, very soft shadows. This is not really what we want. We want something that's going to be mostly white with just black edges. So I'm going to keep this up. I'm going to zoom out, make this a little bit smaller. What we can do, we can increase the distribution, so kind of like the contrast between the dark and bright areas, and we can also increase the fall off and take a look at what that produces. We're also going to just lower this radius down. So that's a little bit better. We have a sharper edge here. Now this plane relatively in the scene is pretty small. It's probably not to scale, so we probably should lower the radius a little bit more. So something like this would be pretty good for our AO. So there's one final type of pass that we're going to add here. That's going to be a Z-depth pass. Now what Z-depth does, it calculates the distance between the objects in the scene and the camera. And Z-depth is very useful to create atmospheric perspective and also for depth of field. So atmospheric perspective here is not particularly important, but in the previous example that I showed with the wingman, I did use Z-depth there to be able to have the other plane, which is further away, appear a little bit more faded because there's more atmosphere between it. And then I also used Z-depth for a depth of field calculation as well. Now, depth of field without a plugin in After Effects is not the easiest thing to achieve. However, I do want to show you how to set up the Z-depth pass here. So right here, I'm just going to disable the AO pass because it's going to take a little bit longer to render. I'm going to go to a top view. And on the top view, I'm going to switch over to the master layer so I can actually see the camera. And we're going to add a measurement calculation between the camera and the plane. Go up to Create, Measure Tools, Distance Tool. Then we're just going to select something in front of the camera to about the midpoint of the plane. And it's going to give us the distance between it. So as you can see, this is really not to scale, but it's fine for what we need. But this number is going to be very important. So going back to Z-depth, let's switch back to our plane layer. Click on depth, switch back over to our camera view. And the depth of the entire scene, we should do something that's a bit larger than whatever the distance is. So we could do something like 20. Go back to IPR. And this gives us a pretty good amount of depth, something that we could edit a little bit later. The depth black, we could increase that number a little bit because it's not that dark at the front. So maybe we could do something like 5 and just reset the IPR. That adds a little bit more contrast. And what you should do now is just go throughout the scene and just make sure that it works at different camera positions as well. So this is getting a bit bright, so I'm going to increase the depth white a little bit, maybe try 25. And that's a little bit better. Now, if you did have more objects in the scene that go further back, you would want to go and make sure this value is enough to go past the objects in the background. So now we can go back and make sure that AO is enabled again. So we're going to go back to our exhaust render layer and just make sure that that is set up correctly because this does use a different render engine. So for this, we're going to do the same thing that we did previously. I'm going to set up version numbers. I'm going to right click version label is 2 / render layer / render layer _ version number. For the image format type, we're going to do EXRs. The data type, we don't need full float, 16 is fine. Compression, we'll use zip. And for the naming convention, we do need to change this. It's going to be name.number.extension. Make sure the sky is also set on V-Ray. Go to render elements, make sure the render elements are set to off on the sky since we don't need any of those passes. And now we're ready to render. There are two main ways you can start batching in Maya. One of them is to switch your shelf over here to the rendering tab, go up to render, batch render. However, if you're using a much more intensive scene file, I would recommend closing Maya completely. So we'll close out Maya, navigate to our project folder, then we'll go to scenes, go to the scene file that you've created, right click, and select render from the context menu. This will open up a little window. If this window closes, it means that the render has stopped. It does not mean that the render completed. It just means that it's no longer rendering. So what I also recommend that you do before you walk away, go into your project folder, wait for the images folder to be created, double click. The temp images folder is going to be for anything that you used in the frame buffer, so we don't actually need any of that information. But this first folder here, version 2, we're starting with the plane, and we've got our first EXR. So I would make sure this actually renders. I would double click your EXR, open it, I recommend using XInView for viewing EXRs. I would recommend the full version of XInView and getting all the add-ons, which includes an EXR viewer, much faster than opening up Photoshop every time. But to view EXRs properly, you're going to want to view them in After Effects with the linearized workflow. So I'll be talking about color management and the linear workflow a little bit later. But for now, just keep in mind that anything you see is going to be a lot darker unless it's in After Effects. Alright guys, so in the next video, we're going to start compositing. So if you learned anything in this, drop a like. If you have any questions, post a comment, and I'll get back to you very soon. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.